revolution. Today, this year, we are living in the greatest time for beer drinkers in the history of the world. I'm not going to tell you all about beer history, but I am going to tell you a little bit about American beer history. Beer history did start approximately 9,500. Archaeologists believe it was the first fermentable beverage. It was also the first beverage that created civilization, but we'll go into that later. If you guys have questions today, by the way, I'll hang out afterwards. Please feel free. I want to get through this so everybody can kind of rumble into the festival and start drinking. They still need about 5 minutes, so we'd just be standing in line there anyways. Really what I want to talk to you about is what happened 92 years ago. In 1918, we had 1,700 vibrant breweries around America. They were producing flavorful beer. And then a little thing happened. It was called the Noble Experiment, or as we all know it, Prohibition. It changed the face of beer across the country for over 60, 70 years. 4 years, nobody got to drink beer. Think about it. If you were 10 years old when Prohibition started, you're now a 24-year-old adult, you don't know what beer tastes like. Now go back and think about the first time you ever tasted beer. Most of us didn't like the taste of beer the first time. So all of a sudden, there's 14 years where they shut them all down. It stopped the whole beer revolution, evolution. So what we have is now, it's 1933. They finally repealed Prohibition. But what do we have going on? We have the Depression. We have Europe going into World War II. So there's a whole group of adults now that have never tasted beer. They don't know what a full-flavored great beer is like. So we have the government telling the brewers, you can't use barley because we need it for the war effort and for the Depression to feed the soup lines. So what did they start doing? They start dumbing down their beer. If the Prohibition was the Dark Ages, the next 40 years was what I like to call the fizzy yellow beer ages. You had brewers that were using corn and rice to add into their... You had brewers that were selling cheap, lowest commodity beer so that they could still make a profit and attract the palates of young adults that had never experienced beer. It wasn't a good time, to say the least. By 1983, we were at our lowest point in breweries in the United States. We had about 45 brewing concerns that were controlling 80 breweries. And everybody drinking fizzy yellow beer. But things changed. All the way back in 1965, that was the first of 3 critical points that has us all here today. A gentleman named Fritz Maytag was sitting in the old spaghetti factory in San Francisco. He was drinking a beer that he frequented called Anchor Steam. The bartender said, "Fritz, enjoy it. It's your last Anchor Steam. The brewery's closing." Fritz wouldn't hear any of that. Luckily for us, Fritz was part of the Maytag fortune that we've all heard of, washers and dryers and whatnot. So he went straight over to Anchor Steam, met the brewer, looked at the brewery. It was in total disrepair. The beers were all soured. The brewing equipment was falling apart. For a little over $10,000, he bought a 51% controlling interest in 1965 and started producing quality beer a couple years later. This led to the first regional brewery that started doing great flavorful beers. Things like Anchor Liberty, Anchor Steam, their porter, stuff like that. Now, that's the first step that helped us to get where we are today. The next step, it's 1977. A gentleman named Jack McAuliffe decides, unheard of at the time. Nobody opened a brewery. He opened a brewery called New Albion. New Albion was the first craft brewery here in America. Very small. It was in Sonoma County. It only lasted 6 years. But what it did, it turned on a bunch of people that were home brewers into the fact that you didn't have to start a big giant production brewery to brew great beer. So he lasted for about 6 years, and 2 years later, Congress passed a law. 1978. The law was that home brewing is legal in the United States. Prior to that, it had been